Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out to our event titled Abbotsforward Thinking. It's nice to see a good crowd on hand. You never quite know how the turnout is going to be, so this is great to see a good turnout. My name is Neal. I'm the Director of Community Planning with the City of Abbotsford. And as most of you, I think, would know, the city is undertaking a major city building initiative right now called Abbotsforward. It's an update to our official community plan. And this plan is really a huge leap forward for the city. And in the end, this plan is really going to set the strategic direction of how the city is going to grow. So through this process, we're reaching out to the community and having a conversation. It's a conversation about choices of how our city is going to grow and what type of city we're going to build. So right now, we have a city of 140,000 people. The question we're asking and the conversation we're having is, what does a city look like with 200,000 people? What does the city of Abbotsford look like with 200,000 people? Where are they going to live? Where are they going to work? How are they going to move about the city? And what type of amenities are they going to be looking for? That's the conversation we're having, and tonight is certainly a big part of that. So with us tonight is Brent Toleran and Jeff Tumlin, two experts in the field of city building. But before we get to them, I'm going to just do a round of introductions with council. We have Council Jahal, Councillor Falk, Councillor Barkman, Councillor Blue, Councillor Ross, Councillor Lowen, Councillor Siemens here tonight, as well as Mayor Braun. And so at this time, I'm going to ask the Mayor to come up and say a few opening remarks.
It's great to see so many people out tonight. As Mark said, I wasn't sure how many people would come out, but we have a great crowd, and I know many people from outside the community, so welcome. It is a pleasure for me to be here for this event, and I thank all of you for coming. People stop me from time to time and ask me about what is Abbotsforward. So what exactly does it mean? And I've been answering it this way. When I'm asked that question, my answer is that it is a collaborative community effort to create a vision or a direction for a city of 200,000 people. And Mark's already said we're at 140, so it's a city that has 60,000 more people in it. Although this is generally seen as a planning event, if we really think about it, planning in a very real sense is about economic development. Abbotsford is about creating a collaborative vision for a city of 200,000 people that is pedestrian friendly and livable. Abbotsforward is also about forward-thinking land use, moving away from ad hoc planning and providing clear, concise, and consistent policies and processes, and no more surprises for developers at the 11th hour. I've been on that side of the fence. It's not a lot of fun. And if we accomplish this, it will give greater certainty to the development industry, reduce the approval process, and enable us to attract quality developers building quality projects that are livable, walkable, and create a vibrant economy. And we will provide our residents with a clearer picture of what may happen or will happen to their neighborhoods. Brent Toleran may have forgotten this comment that I made when I first met him. It's a year ago, I think, or maybe not quite a year. But I listened to him for an hour and a half, and at the end of that I said, Brent, I've never met you or heard you until today, but I like you. I already like you. And the reason was because Brent unpacked things that he articulated things that I instinctively knew was the right way to plan a city. And so it resonated what he said. Brent has also said that we need to do the math. And I believe that Abbotsforward work is showing us it is very important to do the math in order to fully understand and appreciate the cost implications of growth. Many residents want low property taxes, an effective transit system, well-maintained roads, ample parks, a grocery store or coffee shop near their home. Unfortunately, we can't have it all in low-density neighborhoods. Quite simply, continuing with outward growth only is just far too expensive. We must have pockets of high density within our neighborhoods. And we have learned through our Abbotsforward research that density matters when doing the math. So what we are trying to achieve isn't going to happen overnight or even a year or two. And I'm reminded, I try to remind myself of what Bill Gates once said. He said, most people underestimate or overestimate what you can do in 1 year, but they underestimate what you can do in 10 years. And I think we need to keep that in perspective. So every great journey begins with a single step, and Abbotsforward, in my view, is a first step towards a preferred future. That said, I am really looking forward to what our two guests have to say to us, Brent and Jeffrey. Thank you, everyone who chose to be here, and I know that you will not go away disappointed. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mayor Braun. So the format for tonight's event is we'll have two speakers. We're going to give them roughly 30 minutes each. We're going to try to hold Brent to that. And then we'll have a question and answer period after that. So our first speaker tonight is Jeff Tumlin. Jeff has developed transformative plans throughout the world and that accommodate millions of square feet of growth with no net increase in motor vehicle traffic. He has led multiple award-winning projects and has planned in cities such as Seattle, Moscow, and Santa Monica. Let's please welcome Jeff to Abbotsford.
And for those of you who are in the back, there are plenty of empty seats here up front. I promise, well, I won't promise that I won't bite, but it's highly unlikely that I will. As Mark said, my name is Jeff Tumlin, and I was born in Los Angeles. But I mainly grew up in a city called Huntington Beach, which originally was about the same size as Abbotsford and actually used to be surrounded by really beautiful strawberry and broccoli fields, but isn't any longer. Like all little boys anywhere, I was really fascinated by transportation as a kid. And like all kids growing up in the 1970s, I watched a lot of TV. And TV taught me many things. And among the things that TV taught me was that someday owning an automobile would bring me power and freedom and autonomy and social status and hopefully one day sex. Although I wasn't really thinking about that at the time. When I was in high school, my first job was actually at Disneyland in Tomorrowland, next door to this ride called Autopia, which it's actually one of the only rides at Disneyland that is effectively unchanged since the day the park opened in 1955. And the Autopia ride comes straight out of the most popular industrial exhibits in the history of the world. And those were the Futurama exhibits at the 1933, 39, and 64 World's Fairs. The 1939 World's Fair, almost a third of the population of the United States showed up and observed this brilliant future sponsored by General Motors that promised unlimited mobility to all people of all social classes. And perhaps the greatest invention that my country has ever made is in the development of our highway system, because indeed it was utterly transformative, not only economically, but also socially, giving people the opportunity for a kind of social mobility that was never possible anywhere else in the world. And indeed, it was a beautiful promise. The problem was that there were unintended negative consequences. And while many of us still believe in this thing that we were promised, of the promise of unlimited freedom of mobility, there have been some significant downsides that we keep trying to ignore. And we keep believing that simply adding just one more traffic lane will surely finally solve this congestion problem. Part of this belief that just one more lane is going to solve our congestion problem is rooted in the way that we do transportation analysis. And as a transportation professional, I spend a lot of time taking the obfuscating jargon of my industry and translating it into terms that normal human beings can understand, and also deconstructing the very, very complicated tools that we use. One of those tools are travel demand models. And while travel demand models can be really useful tools for comparing alternatives against each other, they're about as good as tarot cards in predicting the future. So don't overuse your travel demand models. And also understand the unintended negative consequences of your best intentions. One of the problems in transportation is the problem of object thinking. The thought that, okay, we have a congestion problem, adding a lane of traffic, congestion problem solved, we can walk away. Unfortunately, running a city is somewhat like running a business. And just like businesses need to think about the entire complexity of their labor practice and how they reward employees in order to get the best performance, so do cities need to think about not only keeping their existing customers happy, but also their future customers. That planning for a transportation system is one of the most complicated things that any city is responsible for. And actions have consequences, secondary consequences, tertiary consequences, cascading consequences that may be far greater in impact than the first primary consequences. Another industry that I pay a lot of attention to is the public health industry, in part because my friends in the public health industry continue to point out to me that I, as a transportation professional, have a greater impact on public health outcomes than the medical industry does. In part because the greatest single indicator of public health is rates of walking. Our bodies are designed, we're sort of creatures of the savannah. Our bodies are designed for optimal functioning when we get 10,000 steps a day. And not only are our bodies designed this way, our muscular systems, our skeletal systems, and particularly our cardiovascular system, our mental processing is designed with a similar set of requirements. Places where walking is a delightful part of everyday life are not only economically successful, but are places that have very, very high rates of public health. One of the things that I also like about the public health industry is it collects really, really good data and does follow-up analysis that's statistically significant, unlike my industry. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta has been collecting data on rates of obesity in the United States every year since about 1985. And, sort of tracking rates, 10% of places in, states like Georgia are obese in 1985. And over time, we notice a remarkable pattern, including several years in which we need to change the scale. 1997, now over 20% of adults are obese in Mississippi. 99, 2000, 2001, we have to change the scale again. 2004, we change the scale again. Again, we need to change the scale, and so on, to the point where in significant portions of the United States, over 30% of adults are clinically obese. This is not only a very unfortunate situation, but an extraordinarily costly situation, particularly in a country that has really lousy healthcare. There's a powerful correlation between rates of obesity and rates of walking, and an even stronger correlation between rates of walking and how we design our communities. And so as you're embarking upon your official community plan, it's one of the things you want to think about is how much walking do you want future generations in Abbotsford to be able to enjoy. Another interesting thing about transportation is its impact on mental and social health. One of my favorite chemicals in the brain is a neuropeptide called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is effectively the biological basis for trust. It's the thing that allows us to believe that if I scratch your back, you'll eventually scratch my back, and that we're all in this together. It's actually a chemical in your brain that does this to you. And we've all experienced it. Oxytocin is produced under a very specific set of circumstances. It's produced when we gaze longingly into the eyes of someone that we love. It's also produced in breastfeeding and in orgasm. But the most common way that it's produced is outdoor exercise. Whether you're, kids, out on your bikes, or you're simply going for a walk. We have all experienced the situation where we were very upset and, angry at our loved one, and we went out for a walk or a run or a bike ride, and suddenly everything felt better. This is not because the world changed, it's because your brain chemistry changed. And something that we find is that in communities where there are high rates of outdoor activity, much, much greater social trust. In fact, Nate Silver, who's a famous statistician, once tweeted his famous heuristic that places without sidewalks vote Republican. On the other hand, when we're trapped in our automobile, there's a whole other set of chemicals that are released in our brain. Road rage is actually a clinical term, and it is the result of a series of factors that our brains evolved to allow us to survive in a very threatening natural world. Those factors are triggered under a specific set of circumstances that occurs many times when we get into a car. One set of circumstances is that we receive an immense amount of social information from people around us. So when you're walking down a crowded sidewalk and you bump into somebody, you don't even need to apologize in words. You can shrug your shoulders or just sort of turn and go like this, and it's completely forgotten about. But when somebody cuts you off when you're driving, you can't see whether that person is trying to apologize to you because you're going too fast and they're too far away. So your brain automatically responds with two threat mechanisms. The threat mechanism that's the physical threat that this person is trying to harm you, and secondly, the threat mechanism that this person is threatening your social status by not apologizing. This triggers your fight or flight response, the same thing that allows us to survive when we're being chased by saber-toothed tigers. And the more that this goes on, the more that the amygdala is triggered, releasing these chemicals, the more your brain changes in order to be able to respond to that situation, which means your ability to think about the consequences of your actions is shut down. Literally, the prefrontal cortex of your brain is cut off from the rest of your brain because you need to react quickly, otherwise that saber-toothed tiger is going to eat you. Similarly, your muscles tension, your muscles get really tight, you get angry and mistrustful, and as this pattern repeats itself, these chemical changes in your brain become permanent. And indeed, for those of us who drive, we have all experienced the sensation of doing or saying outrageous things, angry things behind the wheel that we would never say in a social situation. In fact, many of us, myself included, have actually intentionally done dangerous things because of a perceived slight that somebody in another car did to us. This is a big problem. And yet, in our communities, we continue to design around continued dependence upon the automobile and continued making it more and more difficult in order to walk. And this is true in communities all over the world. So this happens to be your community, but if you were to take away the mountains, right, in the backdrop, this could be pretty much any community of your vintage in North America. There are thousands of South Fraser Ways all over the place in communities of your scale. And all communities like yours are struggling to figure out what on earth to do with places like this. All complaining about them, all trying to reimagine them, and all wondering, how did things get this bad? Well, one of the reasons why things got this bad is that despite the flowery language in some of your existing policy documents that talk about mix of uses and walkability and social equity, this is exactly what your bylaws require developers and your traffic engineers build. This is a perfect manifestation of the laws that your community has adopted. And you can see that it in fact meets the policy goals. So, there's a mix of uses. There's, residential over here, and here's some, offices, and here's some retail, and there's some more residential over here. But you know that if you live in this, you're the poor person who lives in this residential building, and you want to do some shopping over here, you're going to get in your car to go across the street. And indeed, this is the finest roadway design. Look, everything meets the current roadway standards. There are sidewalks, you're meeting the landscape requirements. And look, there's an actual pedestrian, right? So you've succeeded. So one of the things that we observe in pretty much every community that we work in North America is a direct contradiction between the lovely policy language that you've adopted and the rules, regulations, and guidelines that your developers and engineers are forced to build to. So I'm going to talk about some key ways in which you need to make sure that your values are actualized in the regulations of your community. The first, and I would argue most important point, is that you need to make sure that you're measuring what matters. If you have policy goal language that you can't quantify and judge the degree to which you're accomplishing those policy goals, you might as well not have it at all, particularly when you're dealing with traffic engineers. One way that you've told your traffic engineers in order to judge the success of your transportation system is on a letter grade system called level of service. You've probably heard of this, level of service A through F. Level of service measures the seconds of delay that a motor vehicle experiences in the peak 15 minutes of the peak hour of the day that are attributable to congestion delay. Right, what? Exactly. What this says is that level of service A is when the street is completely empty and abandoned. It's great if the stores are boarded up as well. That will make sure that you're maintaining level of service A and that your street is really, really successful. Level service F, on the other hand, is the crowded street where there are lots of people driving in front of you and you actually have to wait in order to get through the intersection. This is really, really bad. You don't want this. This is a failed street, even if it's thriving and no one on the street would ever say that it would be wise to eliminate the on-street parking in order to add another travel lane. Level of service, when applied to other modes of transportation, is oftentimes used in the same way. That level service A for pedestrians is the empty, desolate sidewalk up against the empty parking lots with the tumbleweeds blowing in the background. And level service F is, it's the place where everyone wants to be. You don't want this. Please don't attract crowds of pedestrians, because that's bad for level of service. So as you can imagine, my view is that how you weigh level of service varies depending upon your perspective. With the traffic engineer hating the crowded street and loving the empty, abandoned street, but an economist seeing things from the reverse perspective. Indeed, the economist says that when the street is congested at the peak 15 minutes of the peak hour, that means that it is overscaled for the other 99% of the day, right? And that, in fact, at level service F, supply and demand are in perfect balance. This is the optimal investment in the street. And indeed, what really matters is what are the sales tax per square foot in the retail stores adjacent to that street. Who cares about congestion? And similarly, the empty street is a waste of money. There are other problems with level of service as well, and I'll cut through this pretty quickly because it gets very, very wonkish. But level of service, when you're using it to measure the impact of new development, asks whether level of service is moved from D to E or E to F, and it looks at nearby intersections. So if you're doing an infill development project near your downtown where there's some existing traffic congestion, you may have a lot of local trips that are relatively short, but you're going to have lots and lots of level of service impacts. And so that's really bad. Much better for your developer to move the development to a more isolated rural location where there will be fewer intersections that are impacted, even though that project is generating twice as many motor vehicle trips, and those motor vehicle trips are twice as long, right? So level of service forces us to exacerbate a regional traffic congestion problem in order to pretend that we're helping a localized traffic congestion problem. There are other problems with level of service, a lot of them having to do with biasing that last project in. So it's perfectly fine for a development project to worsen congestion from A to D, but that one small project that trips the threshold from D to E, they're the one who has to mitigate the traffic problem. Similarly, the fact that it really focuses just on local rather than regional traffic congestion. But really the biggest problem of over-reliance on level of service is how we mitigate a level of service problem. If your development project trips an intersection from D to E, typically the response that the developer is asked to make is to widen the intersection, to add another traffic lane, to add the double left turn pocket. This may seemingly solve the simple problem of level of service at this intersection, but it creates some secondary impacts, particularly making it that much more difficult to walk or bike or take transit. Once I've widened this intersection, as happened in this example, this 4-lane street that used to be possible to walk across as a pedestrian is now daunting. I wouldn't let a kid walk across what's now going to be a 9-lane monstrosity. So you've seemingly solved a congestion problem by widening this intersection, but in fact, the mitigation is worse than the original problem that you were trying to solve. You've just created so many more motor vehicle trips by making it impossible to walk or take transit that you're creating more problems than you've solved. Finally, level service ignores any mode of transportation other than driving. It also says that a person on board a 40-person bus is valued at 1/40th the value of somebody driving alone in a car, because level of service only looks at vehicle delay, not person delay. Now, on the other hand, cities all over North America are recognizing this problem and recognizing that transportation is really an investment strategy for achieving a whole host of goals: economic development goals, social equity goals, ecological sustainability, public health, and so on. And that we need to make sure that all of these goals are measured in our transportation analyses. New York has been doing a terrific job of this and using it to justify radical rethinking of their streets. But so have cities of a variety of scales, including Little San Mateo, California, which is a little suburban community that has just completely rewritten their transportation analysis standards, eliminating level of service from consideration. New York said that on their retail streets, what really matters is are people enjoying the streets and are people shopping there? And indeed, what they found is they could eliminate traffic lanes in order to add more outdoor seating without negatively impacting congestion while creating major benefits for motorists, major benefits for the merchants, I'm sorry. And so they've been collecting a huge amount of data about how their streets are being used by all modes of transportation and what the response has been for local merchants as well as for the happiness of the people who are using it. Because in fact, that's what really matters, is do people like the changes? The second point is about using the right tools in order to do the analysis and using them correctly. As I mentioned, travel demand models are incredibly useful for comparing alternatives, but they're about as good as tarot cards in terms of predicting the future. And so understanding how models get used and how we transportation professionals lie with them is really important. One critical factor that all models should include is what we call induced travel demand. None of us likes sitting in traffic congestion. It's incredibly annoying. And so it makes us unhappy. We complain to our city council. The city council makes the traffic engineer widen the roadway in order to make driving faster, which makes us happier and allows us to do new things that we didn't do before, including, go to that new restaurant across town that was, before it took too long to get there, or more importantly, move farther away to the bigger, cheaper house and drive a longer distance in order to get to our job in the center city. So widening the road results in faster driving, which results in more driving, which puts us right back where we started with congestion that's making us unhappy, and so on and so on and so on. Actions have unintended consequences, and simply adding another traffic lane is unfortunately not going to solve our congestion problem. Congestion is not a facilities problem, it's an economic problem. Congestion happens when the demand for a transportation supply equals the supply. It's when the two come into balance. And in fact, congestion is the constant in any successful economy. The only way that we can eliminate congestion is either to destroy the economy, as a city like Detroit has done. It took them 50 years, but they did finally solve their congestion problem, or to manage their congestion through a whole variety of complex techniques. But we can also take advantage of the way that, that market preferences are changing. Travel demand models typically assume that past trends will continue ad infinitum into the future. In the United States, however, as our demographics have changed, particularly as baby boomers have aged and millennials with very different travel preferences than people of my generation, the demand for transportation has taken a completely different course. The San Francisco Bay Area rapid transit system has been shocked and horrified that transit ridership in the Bay Area has increased faster than anyone's wildest expectations because they never asked young people how they want to travel. We all assumed that the travel demand patterns of baby boomers would continue across all spectrums of the population, and now we're finding that vehicle kilometers traveled peaked in 2005, even though our travel demand models say that they're going to continue escalating. Another fundamental thing that all cities need to start with as they're thinking about transportation in their communities is to make sure that the needs of daily life are within walking distance. And more importantly, that that walk is delightful, that it is seductive, that it is not merely functional. And this is an opportunity that Abbotsford really has in terms of thinking about the future. It's both solidifying the core of your city, making it more walkable, because you do have a lot of services here, but also introducing services, little neighborhood high streets in some of your existing neighborhoods. Fortunately, the pattern of development that we've been seeing here in the last couple of years provides just enough density in order to be able to provide retail within a walkable format. And this is something that's really important to understand. You can only get walkable retail if there's enough potential retail market within walking distance. And this means providing just enough density to get enough households, but not so much density that the community character is lost or the transportation system is overwhelmed. So you've got some good bones to start with, but obviously a fair amount of work to do. But taking advantage of the density patterns that you already have in your community is actually a great starting place, and a starting place that many communities of your vintage don't have the advantage of. So, you know, South Fraser Way, great opportunity for reinventing and turning it into whatever it is that you do want. I mean, this is Santa Monica, California, which is a very low-scale, mostly single-family home community, but a place that has extraordinary vibrancy because they made a very strategic decision to emphasize walkability even in Los Angeles County, California, where everyone says that everyone only drives. Not true. Another key point that's important for communities of your vintage is to make cycling work. As market preferences change about what particularly ambitious young people want for the place where they're going to buy their first home and invest in, they're increasingly wanting, walkable, more vibrant places. And when there's not quite enough density to deliver that, a really, really great tool for appealing to future markets is making biking work. And your neighborhoods are very easily retrofittable in order to accommodate cyclists of a whole array of ages, including retiring baby boomers, also young families who want to raise their families here, but to raise them maybe in a different way than I was raised. And you also have a tremendous advantage in the data that say that 65% of your citizens live and work in Abbotsford. Your city is just of the right dimensions to be able to make cycling a really practical mode of transportation for most trips if you design your city in order to accommodate it. It also has, in many places, unnecessarily wide streets that can be retrofitted in order to have some of the best biking infrastructure in North America. And there are a lot of cities like yours that are making these investments, particularly to get ahead of the demographic changes and outcompete other communities of similar scale. One of the things that we find is that there is nothing that makes cycling safer or creates more cyclists than putting cyclists out on the street. Like attracts like. And in cities like Portland or even San Francisco, which you would think would be a terrible cycling city, Instead, we've had an explosion of cyclists just by putting out some infrastructure, getting some people interested in cycling has created a cascading effect. And basically, your target cyclist is, well, it's absolutely women. I mean, that's one thing that we found for sure, is that nothing gets more people cycling than getting women cycling, but women of all ages. And that means focusing not on the people who are out there on their road bikes, wearing Lycra, but on that 80%, 60, 80% of the population that is interested in cycling. The kind of people who, when they're on vacation in someplace lovely, would bike on the bike paths, but would never dream of doing it at home. It's not that hard to make Abbotsford the kind of place that people would come to on their vacation and do a lot of biking. But it means providing really, really high quality facilities, as also some really unlikely places like New York have done that have been able to get a tremendously positive response, even in a place that seems like it would be unlikely to be successful. Another point that's important, and this is true not only for making sure that people of all incomes and abilities have opportunities to succeed in your community, but also for attracting talented young people, because this is one of the things that they're increasingly demanding, is transit that is fast, frequent, reliable, and very importantly, dignified. That is a quality alternative to driving in a car. You've got a reasonably good foundation for your transit and something that your official community plan will be helping to build upon, with about half of your residents within 400 meters of a frequent transit stop. We can do better than that, and we can certainly invest in a lot higher quality. Maybe not this high of quality, but better than what's out there right now. And expect to see similar results in terms of attracting business and talented young people, and also creating mode shift that allows you to bring in 60,000 new residents without having all of them driving in front of you. Point number 6 is to adopt the right street design manual. This is very important. As I said before, South Fraser Way is a perfect response to your current approach to street design. You need to adopt a more modern street design manual that takes walking, biking, and transit into account. Fortunately, there are many communities that have done that already. You can copy their manuals. There are many things that are unique and special about your community. The needs for your street design, not among the things that make you very special and unique. And again, you've already got portions of your community that are ready to have a different design approach. Point number 7 is one of my favorite topics, which is about parking and getting smarter about parking. Parking is a topic that makes people really uncomfortable and brings out a lot of cognitive dissonance in every community that I work in, particularly when I start talking about charging for parking. It's like I might as well be prying somebody's hands off the steering wheel and forcing them on to a bike or something, or just being an evil money-grubbing bastard. The reason we charge for parking is not because we are evil money-grubbing bastards, but to make sure that there is available parking everywhere motorists want to be. That's really the only reason why you should be charging for parking. And one of the first things that you need to do is to make sure that your parking accepts forms of payment that normal human beings have on them, which means credit cards. It means using technology to help motorists find a space, because that's always cheaper to direct motorists to the existing empty space than to build a new space. And it means making sure that you establish the right price, which is always the lowest price that achieves your availability target. It means setting hours of enforcement that correspond with your desire to create availability. And it means investing your net revenue in things that make a difference for the place where that revenue is raised. It also means thinking differently about how you manage parking on your big arterials. So imagine this is South Fraser Way, and you've got different uses, and they have parking lots, and you drive your daughter to school, and that requires a parking space, and then you go to work, and you have to pick your daughter up to take her to soccer practice because she can't walk across South Fraser Way, and you do some parking, some shopping. And this is most of us have lives that are like this, and this is the traffic congestion that results from all that driving and those turning movements. Now, if instead you had a grid of streets off of the arterial and you arranged your buildings adjacent to sidewalks, and you had some shared parking, you could have the same trip where you drove and you parked once, and your daughter can get herself to school, and then she could get herself to soccer practice because she doesn't have to get across the arterial. And you can pick up groceries on your way back from the car, and you can meet up, and you can go home. Exact same trip, no transit, no biking. This was a driving trip, but with dramatically different results for traffic congestion, for land use, for efficiency, and for economic opportunity. So, and then of course, if you add transit, oops, that's the same set of slides, sorry about that. Finally, I think the thing that's most important is for you to create a new vision for your city of the future. One that accommodates all of you who are living here now, but looks forward to who those next 60,000 people are going to be and what they want. How are you going to have another 60,000 people want to move into your community? And how can you make sure that in doing so, it makes your community more like what you love about it, but also more like what the future generations are going to love about it? Ask those future generations what they want. And one of the things that I just want to leave you with is, in order for a city like Abbotsford to be economically successful and to be sustainable, it has to be beautiful. This has to be a place that all of you love and are going to want to protect. It also needs to be the sort of place that is going to welcome in the best new residents, people who really, really want to be here and truly invest here. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Brent, who will talk more about land use. And we'll have time for questions at the end, right? Yep.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff. So you will have a chance to ask Jeff questions in a short while. Our next speaker is Brent Toleran. Brent is very much a part of the Abbotsforward team. He's on the team of consultants helping us with the project, so he's very familiar with Abbotsford and the project we're undertaking. Brent is a nationally and internationally respected practitioner and leader with 23 years of experience in advanced urbanism, city planning, and urban design. He has worked with cities as diverse as Sydney, Auckland, Oslo, London, Ontario, Regina, and now Abbotsford. Brent.
Thank you, Mark. Jeff and I often play similar roles where we go to cities and we are urban provocateurs. And this is a bit of a fun opportunity for me because although I'm here with Jeff tonight to be provocateur, I'm also not just parachuting in and parachuting out. I've been here for about a year working with your staff and our consulting team. And so it's very exciting to be both the provocateur and the people who are one of the people who's working day to day to actually deliver this plan. And I have to start off by saying that allows me to be in a position where I can be extremely enthusiastic about the incredible potential you have here. And it's not because I'm watching you from afar, I'm watching you very closely. And what I'm seeing is very inspiring to me in terms of the messages I'm hearing from your council, and particularly your new council, from your staff, and from the community in the context of the last 8 months or so of starting a conversation about the future of your city. And I see incredible alignment. I see commonality of voice, commonality of messaging, and it's really inspiring me. So I wanted to start off by saying that positive message. But, one of my jobs tonight is to be a provocateur, and you're not perfect, and nobody's perfect, and you have a lot of work to do. So I'm going to cover a little bit about what I think you might be able to learn from to inspire and hopefully influence this process further. And Jeff's not a typical transportation guy. I'm not a typical land use planner. So Jeff, I'll forgive you for saying I was going to talk about land use. I hate that term. I want to talk about a city. I want to talk about how a city works and how a city functions. Am I going to just pop up? Here I am. So better city making relative to Abbotsforward. And note this image right here I have here, because I'm going to come back to it. Just pay attention to it for a second. I knew Jeff was going to talk about sex. He mentioned, I think, orgasms, and I don't think you said that other word we were talking about earlier today. But how am I going to compete with sex? And maybe it's indicative that I'm married and we're about to have our first baby, that I've got Dr. Seuss on the brain. But to me, Dr. Seuss is one of the great planners, one of the great visionaries. And this is one of my favorite quotes from, do you know the book, Oh, the Places You'll Go? It's one of my favorite Dr. Seuss books. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. That's the way he starts the book. Great advice when you're thinking about a city planning exercise. To me, this speaks to confidence. If you've got the willingness to do what's necessary to really steer yourself and really choose a direction and go for it. But here's the counterpoint. The other great planning theorist, Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. You know, he said this when he was winning, by the way, as a boxer. But his theory was anytime you get that shock, the first thing you do is jettison the plan. The first thing you do is throw the plan away. And when you're not talking about a boxing metaphor, in city building, the punch to the face is an economic downturn. It's a developer saying, that's not what I want to build, and I'll go next door if you don't let me build what I want. There's going to be the punches to the face after you do the plan. What, in my experience, differentiates the successful cities from the unsuccessful cities is not following Mike Tyson's advice. Shocker, hey? Mike Tyson is wrong. And I didn't even mention that he bites people. You said before that you wouldn't bite people up front. He's wrong in the sense that the key is to keep your plan. Ironically, if you are into boxing, you know he got beat a lot by people who actually stuck to the plan when they got punched in the face. So that's enough about boxing. That's, by the way, the more I've ever talked about boxing in a planning presentation before. 60,000 people are coming. We made the deliberate decision that we're not planning for a time frame with Abbotsforward. We're planning for an outcome. We're planning for a population. How will city, not just how it'll look, but how it will work as a city of 200,000 people. And one of the things as we were seeking input, the Abbotsford of my dreams looks like, one of the things we said is the OCP needs to be a plan for tomorrow, not yesterday or today. That's an easy statement, but if you really think about what it means we have to get past our preconceived notions about what we like about the city right now, how we think the city works right now, and the idea that it will be different at 200,000 people. It'll either be better or worse, but it won't be the same. And so we have an opportunity in this plan-making exercise to choose to make it better and do what's necessary to make it better, but the status quo is not on the table. The status quo is not an option. That's the bad news. The good news is there's a great opportunity to actually make it better, to match your vision and your values better than the existing city is. And remember I told you to look at that image? We had an interesting aha moment as a project team early on and ultimately throughout the exercise, where we had included an image of, does anybody recognize where this image is? This is the Capers building on 4th Street in Vancouver. And our team had just happened to put it in as a sample photo in one of our early presentations that we were showing to the steering committee, the community advisory committee, to council, to staff. And in every case, someone said, stop, wait a minute, go back to that photo. And we ended up having a conversation that we as a project team didn't expect, talking about these photos. Because the message we got, and I'm serious and honest when I tell you it happened every time, and we kept saying, well, we must be onto something here with this photo because we keep having conversations we didn't expect. The conversation was that there's nothing like this in Abbotsford. They wanted to know where it was. They wanted to know how it happened because it was an aha moment when we realized there's nothing like this in Abbotsford. So one of the key visions we had when we're thinking about the Abbotsford of our dreams is, amongst many other things, mobility, etc., how do we do placemaking? How do we create people places where people can mix? Because one of the observations we'd had is that there are places for people to gather with other like people, schools and churches, etc., but there are very few, if any, places where people of Abbotsford can mix accidentally with people that are different than them. And Jeff talked about the importance of that in terms of the democracy of streets. So this theme has ended up becoming very powerful in our conversation. But notwithstanding that, when we're talking about doing something differently than we have, I often say that at some point in my talk, most of you will be thinking what I call the 8 most unhelpful, unproductive words in the English language. We could never do that in our city. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. If I showed you that from 4th Street in Vancouver, you think, well, that's Vancouver. It's different than Abbotsford. And of course it is. And every other city is different than any other city. But my message to cities around the world, both across Canada and globally, is that you can actually do anything you set your mind to in the city. The key issue is making the decision and following through, because cities are more alike than they are different. Every city is unique. You have to understand the context to do good planning. You have to understand what makes Abbotsford unique and special. But every city is more alike than it is different. The comment I use is, every snowflake is different, but they're all snowflakes. None of them are sofa beds. So they have more in common than they have different. So you can be inspired by, you can learn from every other city. It just means you can't necessarily abruptly and lazily copy, but you can learn. So you can do anything you set your mind to in a city. And an example I use is, this is a city I'm working in, one of my most unusual projects in Medellin, Colombia, which 20 years ago used to be the murder capital of the world. My work there was recently profiled on The National with Peter Mansbridge, if you saw it a month or so ago. This was a city where people were afraid to go out in public because literally they would get murdered. It was the murder capital of the world, by far the highest rate of murder. Pablo Escobar, the drug trade, guerrilla warfare, they had real reasons to avoid the public realm. They were afraid. And in 20 years, they have transformed their city through intense will, determination, a bit of what I call strategic desperation. They needed to change. And they took all that energy and they have transformed the city. They've taken their streets back, they've taken their public spaces back in ways that other cities are marveling at. And I say, if they can do it, any city can do it. Trust me, their problems were much harder than yours. If you think your challenges for change are hard, try Pablo Escobar. They have transformed their transportation system, bus rapid transit, trains, even cable cars to go up into the low-income communities, because they see mobility as a form of equity, social equity, connection. Everyone has equal access and equity to the city. That's how they see mobility. And they even have used escalators and such to change the nature of and challenges associated with grade. But even that city, when they hired me, said, well, we're doing all that, but we can't be a walkable city. Because despite all of our accomplishments, people are still afraid to walk. And I said, you've done everything you've done. Are you telling me you can't tackle that? You're the city that has proved that you can do amazing things. And now they're having a whole conversation and very rapidly having a transformative conversation about the pedestrian being the center of the city. Another example I use, well, I'll ask you, it's a bit of a trick question, but I'll ask you, does anybody recognize where this is? It is a trick question. Again, it could be anywhere. It happens to be Auckland, New Zealand, where I'm working. And the notable point is that they put no energy into their walkable infrastructure, and yet they've been putting what I call eye candy for drivers, a huge amount of energy and money into the landscaping to improve the driving conditions in Auckland. And this was a track record over a while that led to this narrative that Aucklanders, Brent, don't you understand? Aucklanders like to drive. That's our culture. And I said, no, that's your decision, and it's being reinforced by your design. But this was what the mayor said. The mayor said, our goal is to be the most livable city in the world. He didn't give a time frame, which I thought was cute. He didn't technically give a deadline. But the goal was to become the most livable city in the world. And my message to him was, if you want to be the most livable city in the world, then you have to be the most walkable city in the world. You can't achieve one goal without achieving the other. And the remarkable thing, and this started well before I started working with them, so I take no credit in it, but they are doing remarkable things to transform, particularly their multimodal nature, their walkability, their biking, their transit, and creating shared streets that now are act like Werners to share space, to turn dead spaces into people places, and particularly for kids, for using simple things like paint to activate what were formerly gray and dead spaces on their waterfront. And they've transformed their waterfront in a way that is absolutely a marvel internationally. And they did it all because they had a powerful vision to become, and a goal to become, in their case, the most livable city in the world. You don't need to have that specific goal to realize that you can accomplish anything you want to, and you're not held back by your interpretation of the culture you have today. The idea that we're a car, we like to drive, or any of those excuses. What it really takes is what I call will and skill. You've got to have the vision, the determination, and then create or learn the skill sets that are necessary in order to make the change. This plan, the OCP, we've called it a once-in-a-generation catalyst. It won't just answer the questions of land use, it will change the thinking. It will be a catalyst for seeing your city's future differently. It will be a game changer, as powerful and important as you want it to be or as you make it. It can be the document that people 20, 30, 50 years from now look back to and talk about as that was the turning point. Just like in Medellin, the turning point was 1990 when they decided to address the urban violence issue, and they did it. They did it through a plan, they did it through collective will. Or it could be a plan that sits on a shelf collecting dust. It can be a plan that gets no follow-through. It can be a plan where in the first 5 minutes after you pass the plan, you start to make decisions that are contrary to it. Or in the first 5 minutes after passing the plan, you're not changing any of the rules and barriers and standards. All of those things that Jeff and I know are actually right now standing in the way of achieving the plan that you are very likely going to say you want. So it goes back to will and skill to decide whether or not this plan will be transformative or collect dust. When I started the work with your staff, I almost as a bit of just an organizational effort, came up with these top 10 keys to a great plan. And I'm not going to read them all out, but they were things like plan for tomorrow, not yesterday or today, plan for outcomes rather than time frames, which led to our decision to plan for 200,000 people. Be bold, don't be afraid to risk competent failure. Have the confidence to design your plan with both flexibility and clarity and the wisdom and experience to know when to prioritize each. These have become a bit of our magic mirror. We go back to these 10 periodically through our plan and say, are we living up to them or not? And so my friend Patrick, wherever he is, he's been tweeting them out if you're following the Abbotsford Twitter stream, because we want you to be talking about them too. And we want you as a community to be able to hold us accountable as we do our work. Are we living up to these things as well? You don't need to take a picture of it. Just go back into the Twitter stream of Abbotsforward and it's there. The future is full of big, bold ideas, and we're hearing a lot of them through this exercise from your council, from your staff, and from your community. But each one of them has tough choices and gut check moments that you will have to face in order to make the plan real, to keep the plan from just collecting dust. And a lot of those tough choices are going to be hard for you. That's why they're called tough choices. But it will be the successful approach to those tough choices that makes the difference between success and failure. And it's important to succeed because we understand now, better than we ever have, the consequences of not doing things differently in the way we plan our cities. The convergence of issues, affordable housing, rising costs of energy, climate change relative to the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit in our cities, aging population, public health epidemics tied, as Jeff has explained, to urban form and mobility and such, and even things like a loss of civic identity. Better city making in the context of this plan is the one-stop shop, the stone that kills many birds in terms of actually making progress in all of these categories. Climate change, whether you're motivated by greenhouse gas emissions and lowering them, and certainly it's an issue not only internationally but here in our region as well. The public health connections have been really powerful, and I knew Jeff would show you the math, and he's fantastic at it. The only point I wanted to make is how incredibly powerful this conversation is, this new information is to changing the conversation about the way we're planning and designing cities. The doctors and the public health care officials have, I think, been a more powerful influence on the conversation on our city building than our transportation experts, than our climate change scientists. I joke, I think our politicians are trained to listen to their doctors more than anyone else, so we're used to listening to our doctors. But when the public health people, GTA's top doctors, joined forces, 3 regional public health care officials in the Greater Toronto area held a joint press conference and talked about walking, biking, and funding of public transit as a key way to address chronic disease and our incredible skyrocketing public health care costs. And they got a ton of media coverage for that in a way that would have never happened if the 3 chief planners of those regions had called a press conference. So this is powerful, and we need to bring them into the conversation. You'll note, if you've been following the transit referendum, that the head public health official has weighed in on that and said that the most important investment in public health in our region is an investment in transit infrastructure. So it's happening here too. They're weighing in because they're connecting the dots, as Jeff has done, between the way we design and plan our cities and our public health outcomes. And in the work I'm doing in Australia, my actual client is the Heart Foundation. They're bringing me down to Australian cities to talk about different ways, and it's not the cities bringing me down. It's the Heart Foundation, because they know that it does more good for their agenda, for their definition of success, than if they brought down doctors in this particular case. The other thing that's happening in terms of changing the conversation is, as the mayor said, doing the true math. For the first time in the history of Canadian cities are starting to do the math about different options of how we grow. And the math is staggering. If you grow in this direction or that direction, and in this pattern or that pattern, compactly versus sprawl, up the slope in your case versus on more flat, easily and economically serviceable land areas and directions, the differences are staggering, and they're showing up on the front page of newspapers. In the case of Halifax, it was a $3 billion difference between two growth scenarios. $3 billion of public money difference. I'm telling you, that got everyone's attention. Whether you are so-called right-wing or left-wing, $3 billion is a lot of money. It took the ideology out of the debate about how we grow, and it made it a math question. And cities can't afford these kinds of costs. So it is changing the politics, and it's incredibly important to do this math. Now, Edmonton, Calgary, London, Ontario, Halifax, Regina have all been doing this math, and it's been changing the conversation dramatically. Cities are taking control of their financial future. And so I say cities and suburbs are changing not because of ideology, but because of better math. And the other thing is that the demographics are on our side. Jeff's talked about this a bit. What I say is that the two largest cohorts in human history, the two largest demographic groups, the millennials and their parents, who have been called the broken hipsters. Do you know this term? It's a new term that seems to be growing out there. It's about mom and dad of the millennials want to come back to walkable neighborhoods too, and they're pricing out their own kids because they have the money. But they want the same things. Baby boomers are rejecting the peace and quiet of the suburbs in favor of trendy urban developments. So the boomers and the millennials, the two largest demographic groups in human history, are predisposed towards a different kind of urbanism. And the cities that are providing it are the cities that are winning. So again, as an economic development argument for your city, this is the tailwind we have. And then the demographic group in between, the so-called family ages, the child-rearing groups, they're choosing urbanism too. They're choosing urban conditions too, if you design it for them. And cities like Vancouver and many other cities, I just did a study for New Westminster on new policies to require 2- and 3-bedroom homes to be able to fit families, because the cities that provide and design for families, household sizes that actually fit families, public realm design that's kid-friendly, amenities and services that support families like daycare and childcare and schools and playgrounds, those are the ones that are attracting families. And what we're finding is that if you design for kids and families, they come. If they're not coming, it's probably because you've designed your urban environments to literally repel families. And there's a lot of urban environments that have been designed that way. So even the demographic group in the middle wants and likes a different kind of thing, but they have a high standard. You have to design it for them if you want it to happen. So those are the opportunities. The problem is our conversations about how we build cities are full of what I call false choices. Some of the biggest ones are fast versus good. You know, let's get our approval processes faster. But are we getting a better result or a worse result as a result of speed? You don't have to. What I say is if you have a high, clear standard for good quality, you can actually get your approval process faster. It's not a matter of saying yes to anything fast. You want to get to a better yes faster. And you do that by having a higher standard. Good design versus job creation, economic development versus planning, regulation versus creativity, quality versus quantity. These are all false choices. Well-planned smart cities are not seeing conflict between these ideas. They're synergistic. But if your local conversation is still having this kind of false choice, and I've sat in rooms like this where I'll show a slide like this, and I'll know that the mayor, not the mayor in this case, but the mayor in that city, is out there saying, you know, we need to make sure planning gets out of the way because it's standing in the way of job creation. False choice. It's a little awkward when I'm saying what I'm saying in front of that mayor, but that needs to be said. That's an indication you've got a conversation happening that's full of false choices. We know we can do better, but in observing smart cities, one of the things I've observed is that the evolution towards smarter planning has to go through a bit of a learning curve. A lot of cities in North America, unfortunately, are starting off doing the wrong thing, approving the wrong things, requiring the wrong things in terms of their plans and their rules and their regulations, and then they'll get to this advanced stage where I say they're doing the wrong thing better. It's the idea, I was doing work in Florida and they took me on a tour of the new highway with a bike lane attached to it, doing the wrong thing better. And then I was in Brisbane and they were explaining to me they were investing in walking and cycling and transit, but they're also widening the highway. That's have your cake and eat it too. You know, they haven't got to the point where you realize to a certain extent you have to say no to things if you want the public to choose other things. It's as much about what you say no to as it is about what you say yes to. So that's the have your cake and eat it too. And then finally you get to this stage where you're doing the right thing. But the question is, almost on an issue-by-issue basis, you could ask yourself honestly, where is Abbotsford at this point? And a lot of cities, I get this a lot when I ask this question, a lot of them say, we're doing the wrong thing better. And don't get me wrong, that's better than doing the wrong thing. But it's not where you want to be. It's not what success looks like. So in Abbotsford, we have this fundamental question about where the growth is going to go. Is it going to be urban or suburban? I don't know if you folks remember this show that was on for a little while where two real estate agents competed with the public, with a buyer to convince them, do you buy urban or do you buy suburban? I don't know if they got that show in the States. But it was fascinating to me to watch because I'd see the mindset about how real estate agents sell an urban condition or a suburban condition. In our case, the question isn't urban or suburban. The question is both, or the answer is both. But the answer is both better. Because there will still be suburban growth in Abbotsford, but it can't be the same kind of suburban growth that you've had and as much as the suburban growth you've had. It has to be a better and better placed suburban growth. And your infill, your building up of the existing city, there has to be more of that, but there also has to be a better approach, a better quality to that. So it's both, but better. But having said that, you've got to pay, like every North American city has to pay, particular attention to how you do the suburbs. Because as I say, the success or failure of our city regions and ultimately our survival, given carbon footprint implications and such, depends on how well we do our suburbs. Not all suburbia is sprawl. A lot of people use those two terms interchangeably. I don't. There is a difference. There are reasonably well-designed suburbs. But too much of it is. We've got to be honest about that. The majority of suburbia in North America is sprawl. And what is sprawl? There's a lot of complex definitions, but I keep it simple. The problem with sprawl is autodependency. I don't know if, Jeff, you agree. That's the primary condition that makes sprawl sprawl. It's this. It's the idea that the only way in or out is by the car. And the mythology that this is, car ownership, and the reality, that's what sprawl does. If you've got no other choice, that picture Jeff showed of the angry driver, what makes me angry is that I know that being stuck in that car is my only option. I can't even get out of the car and walk or take transit because that option just isn't there. That's autodependency. So we know that it has to do with how we design communities. Jeff's slides are frankly better than mine on this, but it's connectivity, it's how we mix things and separate things, and it's how we think about not just density as a number, but as a way of doing density better, what I call density done well. And it's important to have the conversation about why density is critically important. I started using this slide when I was chief planner of Vancouver. I was out talking to communities about why I, as a city person, was promoting the idea of more and better density. The challenge with that is when anybody talks about density, the perception is, well, density is what developers want to make more profit. So why are we talking about density at all? From a public sector, public interest, Commonwealth perspective, though, density is critically important to achieving many of the public goals that we aspire to. A lot of the things that we say we want to accomplish in the plan we're working on, density is part of that. If not a requirement, at least a support. So reducing energy use in buildings for greenhouse gas emissions, allowing active transport, walking, biking, and transit, not just allowing it, making it, what was your word? I use inviting, you used seductive. And of course, the greenhouse gas emission reductions that come with that. More green design options, not just things like passive design of buildings, but things like district energy systems that are only really possible at minimum density levels. Less sprawl, and that really means less pressure on agricultural land and industrial land and environmental land on the edges, more affordable housing choices, improved public health, as we've discussed, vitality, diversity, safety. We have the data now. We have the math to show that almost any of the things we define success as can be supported, not just if you do density as a number, but if you do it well. And so we talk about what doing it well means. First of all, we align land use and mobility, make sure that these things are considered together as one conversation, not as two silos, competing with each other. We say in this conversation that the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. In other words, if you get your land use right, it does a lot of the work for you. If you have fundamentally the wrong land use decisions, low densities, separated uses, you can spend a lot of money on infrastructure and still essentially fail. Because you're just trying too hard. You're trying to connect nothing from nothing, because the distances are too far, etc., even if you have good infrastructure. So getting the land use right is critically important to mobility. We know that building roads and more lanes of traffic doesn't work. Jeff has explained it very well. The only thing I will marvel at is how long we've known this. The popular media is now catching up to this idea of induced demand and that you can't build your way out of congestion. This is a quote from 1955, one of the smartest people to ever talk about cities. Lewis Mumford, adding highway lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. That was said in 1955. We've known this for a long time, and yet it feels weird, like it's just been discovered. This is a comic book. The Flash, you know, the fastest man alive? In his secret identity, he's talking to a scientist who's talking about why they shouldn't complete the highway. They should invest in public transit. And by the way, Seoul, Korea, where is it? Seoul, Korea tore down their elevated highway, leading to rejuvenation of the area and a reduction in traffic. And then the bad guys crash in. Literally, right at that moment. And I think they were highway engineers. But this is a comic book. If a comic book gets it, why don't our city building processes get it? I think they do, but there's this incredible tension or pushback, and it hasn't influenced things enough yet. In my former city, Vancouver, we took the bold step in the late 90s to say we're not going to balance ways of getting around, we're going to prioritize, because balancing is a bit of code for business as usual. Walking first, then cycling, then transit, then goods movement, and then the car. And other cities of many scales are doing this now too. Calgary has recently put it into their bylaw. The city I worked with, Medellin, Colombia, has put it into their mobility plan and their land use plan. It's a really easy thing to say. It's a hard thing to make real. You have to really commit to it. And Jeff and I have discussed this. It's not absolutely necessary to take that prioritization. But in places that don't get it and still use balance as code for status quo, sometimes you need to do something demonstrative. And prioritization is certainly that. And if you think that Vancouver got there overnight, if you think that that's because, you know, Vancouver is Vancouver, which is different than Abbotsford being Abbotsford, this is what Vancouver used to be. Before the 1990s, we had what was called the Years of the Warlords, where the planners and the engineers hated each other. They clashed constantly. The nickname for the time was the Years of the Warlords, where literally the chief engineer and the chief city planner would duke it out on the floor of council to see who would win. That was the culture then. So the idea that cities just become the way that they are is a fiction. Most cities have had to change, to fight to be that, to make a choice at a key moment. In the case of Vancouver, it was the late 1990s transportation plan that had planners and engineers working together that not only created a much better plan, including that prioritization, but a better culture. And we actually started to use the term at the time, plangineers, because engineers and planners started to have the same common definition of success. Now, you have this challenge now, because Abbotsford's planners and engineers are not on the same page yet. It's probably not as bad as the years of the warlords, but this is a challenge for you. And it's a challenge for every department constantly, where you work on this culture of, do you have the same common definition of success to build a great city, or are you a series of silos fighting for supremacy to figure out who has the most power at City Hall? It's not easy, but no city got there easily. Cities had to fight with will and skill to get there. And this is, by the way, this is Medellin, Colombia, where I worked. This is the Spanish version of that prioritization, if you speak Spanish. In Vancouver, it's about what we call the power of nearness. Everything is close, walkability. In cycling, it's been about years of building this infrastructure slowly, but in recent years, particularly like many other cities in the world, there's been an absolute explosion over the last 5 years of urban cycling. It's gone from 0 to 60, no pun intended. Suddenly, this incredible conversation about urban biking in a relatively short period of time. For me, it's just an extension of walking. It's still a form of what I call the power of nearness. And you don't have to immediately and everywhere go to separated bike lanes, but in the right places and at the right time, this is a critical component for getting you past that hump. I say that in major cities, and not necessarily in cities the scale of Abbotsford. You can't get past 10% bike mode share without separation of separated protected bike lanes. In Abbotsford, it'll be an interesting conversation about what we need to do at this point to grow cycling, and I'm sure many of you in this audience have opinions on that. It's not just about mobility, it's about biking being part of the culture, the texture, the place, and a lot of cities are seeing it as part of an economic development strategy, attraction of talent strategy. There are employers that can only attract talent if they have offices in bike-friendly neighborhoods with bike facilities. It becomes critical for talent recruitment and retention. Transit's certainly a big part of our conversation. I anticipated Jeff would talk about that, so I didn't cover too much. But even something like car share is a critically important piece of that evolution in the city. In Vancouver, every car share space replaces 20 vehicles moving around in the urban environment, taking up space, parking and road space, etc. That's the highest ratio because we have such a successful car share system in Vancouver. That doesn't happen overnight. I could get into how it was created, but that's a detail. The key point is that even a car that's parked still has a carbon footprint, and car share is the key to take houses that maybe still have a car, but park it all the time and try to walk and take transit, but they're not ready to get rid of the car yet. For me, I call it's the proverbial trip to IKEA. We kept our car, my wife and I, for that theoretical monthly trip to IKEA. And then we realized you could take transit to IKEA and IKEA delivers. Plus car share would get us there theoretically too. So it was a big part of getting people from low car use households to car-less households. Methadone? Space is such a key point to make. It's not about what comes out of the tailpipe, electric cars, and even automated cars, because cars still take up space when they're single occupancy vehicles. It's this whole argument. City after city is doing this. You've seen these photographs before? I've been collecting them. I have about 25 of them or so. Fremantle, Australia was the last one. Their mayor held a big event and took a photo like this. And put it on the front page of the newspaper, because it becomes part of the conversation about mobility is about space. If all those 60,000 more people drive their cars, it won't fit well for them or for the people who live here currently. And we've been doing these kinds of things this was from the 1960s. London Transport was doing them. We're doing it in other ways, illustrating how much space it takes to park cars versus park bikes. These have sprung up in cities all over the world. I think Buenos Aires might have been the first, but I can't quite figure out which was. But it's this constant reinforcement of message of space. And it's about rethinking streets not just as places to move people through. There's progressive thinking of transportation folks that say streets aren't just for moving cars, they're for moving people. But the truth is, streets aren't just for moving. They're places to be, to enjoy, to linger. We're calling it sticky streets these days because it's the idea that success is not how many people you move through and how fast they move through. Success can be how you keep them there, lingering, spending more time. And the good news for engineers is we can count that. We can quantify it, and that makes engineers happy. So you can start to have a different definition of success. And in Vancouver, we've been doing it in the work that I led there on Viva Vancouver. We also need to make sure we have a consistently high definition or standard for quality of design. And design is a good thing for economic development. And if you're having a conversation about height of buildings, the conversation has to be about the quality of the tall buildings, not how high they are. And particularly how they land and how they activate and support the idea of a walkable city. You can avoid urban sprawl, but vertical sprawl, this term that some people are using. But what I say is vertical sprawl of tall buildings isn't about how tall the building is, it's about how the building lands. And it's what happens when you come down the elevator. Do you come down the elevator and walk out into your community and walk to the school and the grocery store, or do you come down the elevator, go into the parking garage, and vomit out onto the expressway? One is vertical urbanism, the other is vertical sprawl. But it's about the neighborhood, not about the height of the building. And yet most of the conversation when it comes to tall buildings is about the height of the building. It's the wrong conversation. What I say is tall tower debates could use less dogma and better design. If you're interested in that subject matter, you can Google this article I wrote. Cities are realizing that good design creates value. I'm not going to read this out, but this is the basis of a presentation I did for the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Australia, because her whole campaign is about good design equals economic success, economic value. And the successful cities realize that, and they want to outperform their competition when it comes to, because of all the thing that good design does, from private sector profit to public sector return on investment and spin-off investment, design tourism, attracting talent, and retaining it, all sorts of reasons. But if you're selling out your good design in order to get fast approvals, to send the message to your industry that you're fast rather than good, then you're undermining your own success when it comes to these kinds of things. And your competition, the smart cities, are realizing this. To put it simply, beauty, I use the word beauty too, beauty outperforms ugly. And it's remarkable how expensive ugly can be. And the third aspect of density done well is the amenities. All the things that make high density livable and lovable, because you can do high density unlivable places through bad design, but also through the lack of amenities. And one of the tools we're going to be talking about in the OCP is density bonusing and other amenity tools that have been used here and in other places. The idea is how you achieve the kinds of amenities and neighborhood infrastructure to make density work, to make density thrive, and make higher density neighborhoods, whether they're tall buildings, mid-rise buildings, or ground-oriented density, work better. And there are tools and such that can do that, where you're building parks and plazas and daycare facilities and community facilities, neighborhood facilities as communities grow, but you have to make sure you have the tools in place to actually do that. And the OCP is one way that you enable those tools. So whatever scales of density you're talking about, and some of these scales are no doubt scary for Abbotsford, and many of them we wouldn't even necessarily want to talk about. But the point is, whatever scale you're talking about of density, high-rise, mid-rise, low-rise, the key conversation is about the quality, is about making sure that it performs well relative to whatever your goals are. Goals like walkability and multimodal, it's about how the design works. So if you're doing more mid-rise density, you're doing it in a way that strengthens the street and activates it for pedestrians. And if you're learning from, the lucky thing is that we live in a region where we don't just do tall towers. We've learned a lot well, not a region, but a province, where we are learning a lot about mid-rise development, both what works and what doesn't work in the context of places like the Athletes Village in Vancouver as well. But learning a lot about transit-oriented development in places around the suburbs. And the neat thing when you think about the context we are in is that all over British Columbia, we are actually a leader in the transformation of successful shopping centers and shopping areas into urban places. We're actually held up as the only place in North America where successful malls are transforming into more urban places. In the rest of North America, failed malls are transforming. But here, we're learning how to transform successful malls. This is just one, Brentwood Mall in Burnaby, where the traditional shopping center has been reimagined and it's under construction now, right next to the Brentwood SkyTrain station. All over Metro Vancouver, not just in Vancouver proper, but in the suburbs, Richmond, Surrey, Burnaby, etc. They are transforming these places that are very similar to the context we're talking about, while the malls are still successful, so you don't have to wait for them to fail. This is a powerful opportunity for us. It's also a challenge, though, because as you densify and build these places, you can do it wrong. This is Mississauga, Ontario, where you can see the boxes have been checked. There's high density, check. There's a sort of mixing of uses. The offices are there, the residential's there, the shopping is over here, but there's no integration of them, and there's no place. I've walked this place extensively. It's very unrelenting for the pedestrian because everything is still scaled and separated to the car. So it's a good example that you can do density but not do it well. And they're trying to fix that, but once you do it wrong, it's hard to go back and retrofit. We have the benefit of learning from these places when we're thinking about a potential new center city along the environment that we're in now. We have the benefit of learning from other people's errors. But the vast majority of Abbotsford is not going to be about any of that kind of scale. Tall buildings, even mid-rise buildings. It's going to be a lot of what I call gentle density. Different ways to talk about infill opportunities, opportunities for communities to age in place, to have a place within your community to downsize to, maybe so you can give your parents or your children and their grandchildren your primary house, secondary suites, laneway housing, row houses, etc. These are the forms and ways that communities can become more complete, more able to live in place, can return the population that maybe keeps the school open or supports the local shopping. All of these kinds of scales and densities are possible and powerful, and they don't change the character all that much. There's a place for everything and everything in its place. And so we use these terms, gentle, hidden, and invisible density, to describe the ways that communities can change while still maintaining the scale and character that people are used to. And it's less scary. It's important to be able to show these kinds of examples. This is just one, laneway housing, that I put in Vancouver, where people told me this wouldn't have that much of an effect. Why are you putting energy into this? You know, we've got much bigger population needs in this city. Why so much energy into laneway housing? Well, we've got over 1,500 of them already approved, which, by the way, is about 1,485 more than any other city has approved that we've researched and checked in the work that I did there. And the cool thing is it's transforming neighborhoods because it's allowing movement within the neighborhood so that when people downsize, they don't have to move away. They can move into the laneway house and give the primary house to their kids and grandkids. They can use the laneway house as a rental suite, as a mortgage helper. They can go through the life cycle of both their age and their economic status and still stay in the neighborhood. And it's one of the biggest challenges we have when we try to freeze our neighborhoods in amber and don't allow them to change. They don't allow that kind of flexibility, that aging in place. So having that conversation is really powerful in communities. But when we talk about density, and even density done well, it's never easy. This was a headline in the Georgia Straight. Density conversations are never easy. And this was a poster that a community group did while I was chief planner in Vancouver, where the proposal was to change the scale along an arterial from 4 stories to 5 stories. Just one extra floor. And that's what was going to happen, attack of the 50-foot condos. So community discussions about density and change are never easy, but they are usually healthy if you do them well. And we're going to have that conversation about what change means and what density means as we go through this exercise. But the message I always give is density is not a conversation about a number. As Jonathan Barnett put it, it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. So I think I probably went over, but I'm going to end by going back to one of the first messages from those 10 principles about this being a plan for, not for today, but for tomorrow, not for yesterday, and not for today, but for tomorrow. And as we do this exercise, it's really hard to think about the future because the future is not going to be like today, but more so. It's going to be different. And remember, this is Abbotsforward, not Abbots present or Abbots past. Those won't be new hashtags in our exercise. This is about a different kind of city and a better kind of city, and a city that you're choosing to become. Thanks very much.